Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Today I'm going to present on the topic of my PhD thesis or the doctoral study, namely the non-visual aesthetics, the Ästhetik des Nicht-Visuellen. Is aesthetics as a science of perception invalid if one of the five senses, namely the visual sense, is left out? This doctoral research delves into conceptualizing a new aesthetic without the visual sense. The overview of the Western aesthetics shows so far the aesthetics couldn't really do without the visual sense. Heraclitus is of the view, I quote, eyes are more exact witnesses than the ears, unquote. Kant posits the sense of sight as the most precious. In his work Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty states that the sense of touch cannot be equated with the sense of sight as far as spatial perception is concerned. I quote, the patient's amazement and his hesitant attitude in the new visual world into which he enters shows that the sense of touch is not spatial as is sight. We conclude that the feel of touch is never fuller as visual, that is, a tactile object is never present in all its parts as is the case with a visual object, and in short, touching is not seeing, unquote. This sight-centric approach not only fails to grasp the vitality of the four senses, but also denigrates them. In her book, Urban Smellscapes, Victoria Henshaw has rightly pointed out that the smell remains one of the most marginalized senses in the Western philosophy, and the one people are most willing to lose. While reflecting on the repulsive nature of the sense of smell, Kant posits, I quote, which sense is the least rewarding and the most dispensable? That of smell. It is not rewarding to refine and cultivate it, for the objects of revulsion are more than the objects of comfort that it provides, and the way of enjoyment by this sense can only be fleeting and transient, unquote. Helen Keller, on the other hand, describes the sense of sight as, I quote, a potent wizard which transports you across miles and all the years you have lived, unquote. In contrast to her sighted counterpart, a blind person perceives a landscape dominated by flowers sharply or primarily through the olfactory sense. This determines the vitality of the olfactory sense so far as the aesthetic perception of a blind or a low vision person is concerned. The sense of taste occupies even a lower, rather the lowest position in this hierarchy of senses. Indian aesthetics of the rasa, on the other hand, puts the sense of taste on the primary position, which the analysis reveals doesn't hold true either. And yet, the methodological framework of rasa was selected to make space for analyzing the literary text of the blind and visually impaired writers, which form the primary text corpus of this doctoral study. It was essential to add on to the existing framework of the rasa and aligned with the traditions. Besides the concept of nav rasa, which is now added on by Shanta Rasa, the concept of peace, and others, this doctoral study intends to add on the concept of Adrishya Rasa or non-visual aesthetic perception to the existing Rasa framework. Though the aesthetic process and the determinants or stimuli leading to the aesthetic perception are primarily visual, the non-visual perception is truly possible by the concept of Adrishya Rasa or the non-visual aesthetics. This can be illustrated with the help of the example of the portrayal in Shrangara Rasa or love, wherein the determinants or the stimuli used in invoking this rasa remain primarily visual. These are the view of the beloved, pleasant landscapes, ornaments, costumes, and so on. So is the case with responses which manifest themselves in the form of embraces, sneaking glances, looking sideways, fine gestures with the eyebrows, which are difficult to perceive with the visual sense. Furthermore, it's not the mere lack of visual input which proves to be the area of hindrance, but the inability to activate imagination which remains the area of concern. That is, the very realization that the awareness required to invoke non-visual pictures and the role the imagination plays in the same process is missing. These reasons depict the vitality of coming up with an independent concept of adrishya rasa. Accordingly, the non-visual aesthetics or adrishya rasa is posited in order to make space for the analysis of the literary texts, particularly travelogues, short prose, and poetry, which constitute the research object for this study. The adrishya rasa is not a mere outcome of the lack of visual sense or the compensation of four senses, nor is it supernatural or the heightened sense caused due to the utilization of four senses. The potential of adrishya rasa means a different, unique aesthetic perception derived from the optimum utilization of four senses coupled with unparalleled imagination and empathy. It is to be noted that for the blind aesthete, the aesthetic experiences are not formed in a vacuum, but are largely dependent on negative and positive experiences on personal and social fronts. This clearly depicts the reliance of the blind aesthete or writer on sighted assistance in order to get the descriptions of the landscape and his or her surroundings, and also for mobility purposes, which are important factors as far as the aesthetic perception is concerned. This brings out the vitality of empathy in the aesthetic perception or the adrishya rasa, which remains the unique feature of this non-visual aesthetics. It is taken into consideration that imagination plays an entirely different role for a blind or a sighted aesthete. Along with the combination of the four senses, the imagination for a blind aesthete plays the role of coming closer to the perceived reality, filling in the gaps, and completing pictures, a term which is not to be equated or aspired with that of a sighted aesthete. Due to the differing role of imagination, this gives rise to a unique form of aesthetic perception, whereas for a sighted aesthete, the imagination at times serves the purpose of taking flight from the reality. Thus, it is to be concluded that the imagination for a blind and a sighted aesthete is of a different kind. For a sighted aesthete, it plays a role from perceived reality to imagination, whereas for a blind aesthete, it leads from constricted perception to wider imagination, pitching in the gaps caused due to the visual stimuli and optimal utilization of four senses, leading to a qualitatively different aesthetic perception. This aesthetic perception or pleasure cannot be temporarily invoked by a sighted person. In case of born blind individuals, it has to be inculcated and trained from childhood. In case of late blind individuals, however, this perception depends on various factors such as adaptability, the acceptance of one's own disability, the focus on auditory, tactile, and olfactory senses, which is so far predominantly occupied by the visual sense, the extent of loss of vision, and so on. Adrishya rasa. We now come to the actual term of adrishya rasa. The word rasa here means literally taste, flavor, juice, or essence. In this context, however, this term denotes aesthetic pleasure. The term adrishya in this context denotes the lack of visual perception. So, the term adrishya rasa leads to non-visual aesthetic perception. Like the classical components of rasa, the adrishya rasa is also based on the four major components, that is vibhava, the determinants of the stimuli, anubhava, responses, vyavachari bhava, the transitory emotions or state of mind, and sthayi bhava, that is the permanent, stable state of mind. Let's focus now on the sthayi bhava, that is the stable emotion or the permanent state of mind. The reflexive self-consciousness forms the sthayi bhava or the permanent state of mind of the adrishya rasa. This state is an outcome of constant reflecting on one's own disability, facing the reality, accepting challenges, and asserting oneself, be it day-to-day chores or a Herculean and a life-affirming task like climbing Everest. This self-awareness or self-consciousness is an outcome of constant rediscovering oneself, which in turn is an outcome of overcoming limitations and crossing boundaries posed due to one's disability. Consequently, nothing can be taken for granted. It is to be noted that the self-consciousness, the reflexive self-consciousness for late blind individual oscillates between desperation and hope, which resurfaces itself. To put it more clearly, it's rather a tug of war between desperation, which tries to gain an upper hand, and hope, which constantly resurfaces itself. Yet another interesting aspect which leads to this reflexive self-consciousness is adaptability, harmony, the desire to prove one's own worth, the desire to lead a normal life, and the intrinsic urge to gain first-hand experiences, which is particularly more intense in case of born blind writers. As far as the stimuli or the determinants for the adrishya rasa are concerned, these are an outcome of the external impressions caused due to the four senses and their combination. They mainly comprise of the sounds in the surroundings, varied fragrances, chirping of birds, the voices of the fellow human beings, which occupy a very predominant position in the non-visual aesthetics, animal and human footsteps, and various other combinations of senses which result in enriching and vivid stimuli. Interestingly, one of the unique stimuli, which is an important feature of the non-visual aesthetic perception, or rather a door to the non-visual aesthetic perception, is the navigation or tapping with the white cane, which is an intrinsic component of the non-visual aesthetic perception. Furthermore, it's interesting to note the effect of phenomenon such as sea waves which manifest themselves as an audio-tactile stimuli, which is otherwise, in the case of sighted aesthete, perceived with a predominantly visual input. In the case of responses, these are also primarily based on the four senses and their combination. In addition to the classic responses, such as smiles, more types of anubhava are added which remain exclusive to the non-visual aesthetic perception. These constitute mainly the gestures associated with touch while looking for objects, vertical or horizontal movements of the body while in the desperate attempts of finding grips during climbing, turning of the head in the direction of the sounds, which is an outcome of both a mere attempt to see or rather an attempt to listen more closely, limited body gestures, rather visual gestures, and so on. Besides, it's interesting to note that for late blind individuals, the anubhava occupy an intermediary position between the visual and the non-visual world. That is, they cannot express themselves, or rather the responses cannot manifest themselves completely on a visual plane due to the lack of visual input. On the other hand, it of course depends on the degree of acceptance of one's own disability, but it is to be noted that the responses in the case of late blind individuals do not assume or take a complete non-visual form either. As far as the transitory emotions or Vyabhichari bhava are concerned, these again comprise of more feelings in addition to the classical 33 Vyabhichari bhava or transitory emotions portrayed in the concept of Navarasa. Again, aligned with the tradition, I have added to the existing transitory states, which manifest themselves in the form of loss, hope, love for adventure, empathy, nostalgia, helplessness, desperation, angst, sadness, disappointment. Helplessness caused due to the lack of visual input, the fear of failure caused due to the lack of visual input, disappointment, curiosity, anger, and so on. Again, for the case of late blind writers, it is to be noted that the forms of desperation and hope, or the combination of these two transitory emotions, occupy a prominent role as far as their aesthetic perception is concerned. This could be attributed to the constant fear of loss of vision, which feels like sand slipping through their fingers, and the hope which lets them cling to their rest of their vision. So these components, when combined in the given situations, result in the non-visual aesthetic perception or the adrishya rasa. It is to be noted that the aspect of inner world remains constant in case of born blind writers, which could be explained with the example of the text Balance Act by the blind climber Andy Holzer. On the contrary, the acceptance of the inner world, or rather the efforts put in aligning with the same, depend on the varying acceptance of the visual perception, rather its loss, and also the shifting of focus which is so far occupied by the visual sense. Again, as the analysis of the literary texts reveal, that the authors find it immensely difficult, particularly the late blind authors, as portrayed in the poem Blind, that is Blind by Dieter Kleffner, and Blind jetzt halt anders by Karin Klaasen. In these cases, the authors depict a strong resistance to align with the inner world. Rather, the capacity to perceive and invoke visual pictures is completely undermined due to the lack of visual input and the shock due to the fear and loss caused due to the same. This brings me to yet another important point for today's conference, that is the formation of pictures. In this case, the formation of pictures is based on aesthetic perception and is closely related with the non-visual aesthetic pleasure or the adrishya rasa. The formation of picture occurs when the impressions are formed due to the external sensory perception. These are, of course, non-visual in nature. To take an example, the object which is encountered, or rather the sense which comes in contact with the object, is activated by the external determinant or the stimuli. This occurs in case of blind individuals while they at times literally bump into a specific object. Let's assume that the sense of touch is activated by an object spontaneously coming in contact with the tactile sense. This leads to the formation of the tactile generation, or rather a tactile idea which is just partly present, which needs to be supplemented with the other sensory organs. At this stage, the imagination plays an important role in combination with memories in order to complete this picture. Thus, it's evident that the sensory impressions combined with non-visual perception and imagination and empathy enable a blind aesthete to form their own pictures, rather to paint their own pictures, to term it aesthetically more correctly, which remain highly subjective. An important question which is addressed in the study is, how do blind aesthetes who are born blind process and form their pictures which remain highly non-visual? In contrast to the late blind individuals whose pictures assume a different form because they are predominantly visual in nature till the given point of the loss of sight. The question in this case arises, to what extent do the erstwhile pictures or images acquire the non-visual form? That is, to what extent are the visual memories preserved even when the input on this front remains absent for years? These aspects are contemplated in these studies along with the linguistic aspects associated with the non-visual aesthetic perception, or rather the linguistic differences which underline the texts of the blind and visually impaired writers, which have been so far neglected by the mainstream, be it German studies or aesthetics. Conclusion. This doctoral study posits the non-visual aesthetics or the adrishya rasa based on the analysis of the literary text by blind and visually impaired authors and development of a new concept based on the rasa framework, namely the adrishya rasa. This concept is based on optimum utilization of the four senses coupled with imagination and empathy. The concept of adrishya rasa plays a prominent role in opening new doors and widening the horizons of the aesthetics so far as the terrains of non-visual aesthetics and contemporary literary texts of German-speaking blind authors are concerned. These are the areas which remained unexplored till today. Thank you for listening to me. Please do check out my book, Die nicht-visuelle Ästhetik, or The Aesthetic des Nicht-Visuellen, which would be published next year with Königshausen and Neumann. I really look forward to your comments and suggestions. Thank you once again. Have a wonderful day. Ich wünsche Ihnen einen schönen Tag. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Auf Wiedersehen. See you again.